Merry Christmas one final time from Daily Dose. Hope you enjoyed the Matthew videos, taking a look at how the evangelist engages with a bunch of Old Testament passages and sees them as fulfilled in the birth of Jesus. In this special Saturday edition, I'm going to take a look at a different issue that often arises among laypersons, among those who are in the pew, as to what are the different ways in which the writings between the Old and the New Testament anticipated some sort of Messiah figure. And in this context, we're talking about things like the Dead Sea Scrolls or Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha and so forth. And if you're interested in this topic, I actually produced a whole book on this topic called Corpus Christologicum. Came out a couple years ago with Hendrickson Publishers. Subtitle is Text and Translations for the Study of Jewish Messianism and Early Christology. And in it, I provide the primary text, a translation, a bit of commentary and bibliography on these kinds of passages. What are the different places that we can go? Including the Septuagint, by the way, but also other writings that are relevant for tracing out different ways in which Second Temple Judaism had some sort of view of a Messiah figure or a deliverer and so forth. In this particular video, I'm just going to look at 5. We're going to take a look at the Psalms of Solomon, something called 1Q28, the Covenant of Damascus CD, 4Q174, and 1st Enoch. Now, keep in mind, this is 5 out of 284 examples that I tabulated in that particular book. It's a lengthy and very technical book. So if you want to find out more, go buy the book and take a look at it. Hopefully you'll enjoy these sort of writings that are relevant for understanding what's the thought world that we're entering into when Jesus shows up on the scene. And so we're going to begin with the Psalms of Solomon, and there's a big debate about what exactly this writing represents, who wrote it, and so forth. I'll have a whole video on that down the road because it's mentioned in Codex Alexandrinus, although the text itself is not in that particular codex. It will show up in like Rolf's Honhart. It shows up in our Septuagint Reader's Edition, but it has a very, very interesting backstory. Chapter 17 and 18 are very famous in the Psalms of Solomon because they are the most explicitly messianic, talking about a Davidic king and so forth. And so let's take a look, and I'll do a little bit of Greek work on this one, show you the translation. Some of the others will just focus on the English. So let's dig into Psalms of Solomon 17, and we're just going to jump around to a few verses. It's quite lengthy. And so I'll do a bit of reading here. Su, Kyrie, eretisoton Dawid basileia epi Israel. So you, Lord, notice the vocative there, have chosen David as king over Israel. And then, su omosas alto, so you swore, so that's swore an oath. Altu peri tu spermatas altu, so concerning his offspring. Eis ton iona, so eternally or forever. To me eklepein, so this is an infinitive with this genitive article there, so that he would not, or so that there would not be lacking, or that there would not be missing or forsaken. Apenantesu, before you. Altu, or basileon altu, so his kingdom would not fall before you or something like that. I'll show you the translation in a minute. And in case you're wondering, these underlines are part of the book, and they're sort of different tags that get into how you can track different themes across Corpus Christologicum. So don't worry about the underlines. Skipping on to verse 21, Ide Kyrie, so look or behold, Lord, okay, anastason autois, so and rise up for them, referring to Israel, Tan Basileia Alton, their king. Huion Dawid, the son of David. So notice there's a Davidic king here, which of course is reflecting on 2 Samuel 7:14 and a bunch of other traditions from the Hebrew Bible. Eistan Chiron, at the appropriate time. Han Idesu, whom you saw or perhaps even foresaw. Hatheos, God. To Basilusai, notice another articular infinitive there with Basiluo here. To reign or to reign as king over Israel, your servant. So here's the translation, and you can take a look at that and maybe do some practice if you want, but hopefully my explanation made some sense. So you'll see that there's this great hope expressed in the Psalms of Solomon for a son of David to be king that God has appointed or chosen to be king over Israel, his servants. And then a couple more verses. Verse 32 is probably the most famous in the Psalms of Solomon, in my opinion. And so we're talking about this Davidic king. So, and he, Kaialtas, Basilus dikaios, he will be a righteous king, didacta supo theou, so taught by God, ep altus, upon them or over them, that is over Israel, Ke uk estin adikia. So there will not be injustice or unrighteousness. In teshe meres altu, in his days. In meso alton, in their midst, as he's reigning over Israel. Hati pantes hagioi. So all will be holy. So notice it's a predicate position there. You'd have to supply the is. And then finally the statement is kai basilu. So he is their king. Christos Kyrios, the anointed one. So there's your Messiah language there. And in fact, he's called Kyrios. But there are some textual variants that actually make this genitive. So he's the anointed one of the Lord, which would be the OU ending of Kyriou there. And so that's a pretty interesting textual variant there. Is he being called Christ the Lord, or is he being called the Christ of the Lord? And so that's a very famous textual variant. And then lastly, we get a sense of this militant nature of this king in verse 35. Petaxai, he will strike for he will strike the earth to gain, to lago to stomatos altu, by the word of his mouth forever, eis tanaiona. Eulegese laon kuriou, so he will bless the people of the Lord in wisdom and Sophia, met euphrosunes, with rejoicing. So you can see the English there as well. So what's interesting about the Psalms of Solomon is that it expresses what I would take to be a fairly common intertestamental view, derived, of course, from the Old Testament, that this Davidic king or this Messiah figure, this Christos, will be a militant figure. He will reign over the earth. He will also have a kind of conquering nature, as you would expect. And that's probably why when you get to the New Testament, not because they're drawing on this particular writing, but multiple times you'll see the disciples or other people say, hey, Jesus, are you going to be the one who's going to take back over from Rome? Are you going to now bring your kingdom on earth? There was this idea that the anointed one would indeed have a militant role. Of course, as you read the New Testament and you just see the words of Jesus, he says, look, my kingdom is not of this world. It's coming from heaven. There will be a time, you see this portrayed, for instance, in Revelation, where he will indeed strike the world with the word of his mouth, but that's not now, that's later. So it's a question of timing, less so much about the actual nature. He will be a warrior king. That's just not what he came to do in the first installment, so to speak. So Psalms of Solomon, even though I'm not sure it's necessarily widespread or being used by early Christians, it's unclear how popular it was. It certainly expresses a certain thought world, a certain ideology about this righteous Davidic Messiah who's going to have a military presence and so forth. And that's underneath the hood, if you will, of some of the Jews in the first century who are reacting to Jesus and thinking, okay, maybe he's going to do the same. So that's Psalms of Solomon. Let's now take a look at the so-called community rule, which is, it was found in the first cave. There's the one there. It's numbered 28, or S is the old nomenclature for it. And this is what it looks like, or at least portions of it. And so let's get into the text itself. Now, I'm not going to necessarily read the Hebrew. This is not Daily Dose of Hebrew, but it's there on the screen if you want to take a look at it. It, of course, is unpointed, being Qumran Hebrew, but hopefully you can make some sense of it. And let's read the English. I'll point out a few things as we go. Now, the community rule is kind of the rules and regulations for the Qumran community, which may or may not have been the Essenes that Josephus describes. And so there's a lot of ins and outs in terms of how you enter into the community, what are the rules of engagement, and so on. But there are also some messianic type things that show up in it as well, for which it is very famous. So picking up we're in column 9, picking up in line 7 here. Only the sons of Aaron, so this would be a priestly idea, will exercise authority in judgment and property in terms of how they run their community. By their word, the lot will be cast for every preparation of the men of the community, and the property of the holy men who walk blamelessly. Their property must not be mixed with the property of men of deceit who have not cleansed their path to separate from iniquity and to walk in the blamelessness of path. And so sometimes these Dead Sea Scrolls can be a little bit convoluted in terms of understanding what exactly are they talking about here. Because partly what they're doing is they're taking perhaps Levitical statutes or other parts of the Old Testament, reconfiguring them and applying them to their own community out there on the west side of the Dead Sea. So it's not always 100% clear exactly what they're getting at, but we'll build to the crescendo here in a second. And from any counsel of the law, they must not depart. And quite famously, there's some Dead Sea Scrolls that describe, like 4QMMT, how keeping the law is the way that you earn righteousness, so to speak. But here is the climax. In all the stubbornness of their heart, they will be judged by the first judgments in which the men of the community began to be instructed. And so they're talking about here's how we live. In this whole section, okay, here's how we avoid blamelessness. We live in the counsel of the law. We got people who are teaching us and so forth. The sons of Aaron are the ones kind of calling the shots until the prophet comes. Now, you'll see elsewhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls that there is a Deuteronomy 18 angle here, this eschatological prophet. Notice he's coming in the future, so it's Bo Navi here. And this is what made this scroll very famous, the Messiahs. Notice it's Mashiach. It's a plural there. You see that yod at the end. That makes it plural of Aaron. There's your Aaron, and Israel. There's your Israel here. And so this was one of the really mind-blowing passages that when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the 1940s and ultimately published through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where you actually have not one, but two Messiah figures. And most likely the Aaron one is a priestly Messiah, and the Israel one is probably a kingly Messiah. And we do see elsewhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls that this king is associated with the house of David. And so what's interesting about this is that apparently this community didn't or at least portion of this community, didn't think necessarily that there would just be one singular Messiah, anointed one, but there would be perhaps two. One who is a priest, one who is a king, and in fact, notice they do believe in some sort of eschatological prophet. Now, they thought that this was all going to be three different individuals. Of course, when you read the New Testament, we realize that actually there is a fulfillment of this idea, but it's all in one person, namely Jesus Christ himself. And so you see that they're trying. In other words, I tell my students that the Qumran community, they weren't necessarily wrong in this anticipation. They were trying to read the scriptures, as we'll see in a minute, that they were interacting with a lot of different Old Testament passages. They just hadn't gotten the key insight, which is all of these different messianic expectations are not one or two or three different figures, but they're all going to be resolved in one particular figure, and that's the big aha of the New Testament. So pretty fun here to see the community rule anticipate not one but two messiahs. Zooming in there in case you want to take a look at it more closely. Now, let's move on to the next fragment, which is from the so-called Damascus document. Its siglum is CD. We're going to look at columns 7 and 8. And this is, in a certain sense, similar to the community rule, where it gets into how does this community operate, and when you enter into it, living out there in the wilderness, what's it going to be like, and so forth. So let's take a look at this particular fragment. Again, we're only going to cover a few bits and pieces here, and actually going to pick them in verse 16. And we read, I will raise up the booth of David that has fallen. Now, this is from Amos, which is famously quoted in Acts. And the interpreter here says this: the king is the assembly of the Kiyun, and there's a big debate about what that is. It's that Hebrew word there, of the images. And the books are the prophets, whose words Israel despised. So this is partly going back to some prior stuff. And the star is the interpreter of the law. So you see the Chochav here, and he's the Doresh HaTorah, which is interpreter of the law. There's a figure that runs throughout this Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's not 100% clear who this person is. It probably was an actual person, maybe the leader of the sect. Sometimes he's called the interpreter of the law. Sometimes he's called the teacher of righteousness. And they could actually be two different people. We don't exactly know, but he's some sort of figure of significance, but he's not actually the Messiah. But the star here, who will come to Damascus, just as it is written, a star will go forth from Jacob, and a scepter will arise. And we'll see the rest of it here in a bit. This is, of course, Numbers 24:17, which we covered previously in Christmas week, mostly from the Septuagint perspective. But here we now have an interpretation of who that star is, and they apply it to someone in their midst known as the interpreter of the law. So it's quite interesting how the Qumran community takes that particular oracle. Let's continue. So he's from Israel. Then he goes on to say, or the interpreter says, the scepter, because that's the other part of Numbers 24:17, is the prince. He's a Nasi. Not quite a king, but a prince of the whole congregation, typically referring to the Qumran community. And when he stands forth, notice that this is very eschatological, he will tear down all the sons of Seth. That's the rest of Numbers 24:17. Now, who are these people? They escaped at the time of the first visitation, that is the visitation of God himself in judgment, typically understood to refer to either the northern or southern kingdom exile, while those who turned back were delivered over to the sword. And thus is the judgment of all those entering his covenant who did not hold fast in them. They will be visited in other eschatological divine return and judgment unto destruction by the hand of Belial. Now that's pretty interesting because Paul mentions this as well in his writings, this Belial figure, some sort of demon or fallen angel. And that is the day when God will visit. So it's quite interesting, in other words, that the star in Numbers 24:17 and the scepter are applied actually to the existing community. This teacher, this prince who is going to be involved in some sort of eschatological events when God comes back in a second visitation. Some of the other bits and pieces of this are a bit obscure, but that's pretty fascinating how the community is applying Numbers 24:17 to their own present interests. Let's move on now to our fourth passage, which is known as 4Q174. That means it was found in the fourth cave. It's number 174, but it typically goes by florilegium, and that's just a fancy word for a collection of Old Testament citations that are strung together, most likely because the person who makes this list of passages considered them to be thematically related to one another. And we're going to look at a couple of the different fragments here, kind of picking up in the middle of things because it's not a complete fragment. We'll read this. And the Lord declares to you that he will build you a house. This is going back to 2 Samuel. I will raise up your offspring after you and establish the throne of his kingdom. So here we have a Davidic kingly promise, and I will be to him a father, and he will be to me a son. So look at 2 Samuel 7:14, very famous. Now, here's what the writer does. He, that is, whoever this passage is referring to, is the sprout of David. And not getting into it in this particular video, but there is a sprout or a tzemach there that shows up in both Jeremiah and Zechariah, and actually one of the kind of variant ways to take a passage in Isaiah as well. It's the tzemach Dawid, the sprout of David, and running throughout Qumran writings, this sprout is a messianic figure. He will stand forth, so you can get a sense for the eschatological nature of it, with the interpreter of the law. We saw that in the prior one. So they're not the same person. Apparently you have a sprout of David who is distinct from the interpreter of the law. And then we're kind of missing some portions in Zion in the end of days as it is written. And once again we have, I will raise up the fallen booth of David. That again is Amos 9. And so they're basically combining 2 Samuel with Amos and saying, hey, this is a sprout. This is a new growth from David who is going to stand forth in Zion at the end of days. Let's go on a little bit further. Continuing the Amos 9 quotation, this booth of David that has fallen, who will stand forth to save Israel. And then we have a pivot to a passage that I've covered previously in Daily Dose. Why do the nations rage and the peoples devise a futile thing? Now, this is from the Hebrew version. The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his Messiah. So this is Psalm 2. We've seen that previously, the Messiah there. So even though they don't provide further elaboration here, because this is very fragmentary, presumably they did, what's interesting about this whole thing is that you have a combination of the Amos 9 passage with the 2 Samuel passage on the prior view there, with the Messiah in Psalm 2, and clearly reading them in this eschatological, messianic kind of way, which is fascinating because you see the exact same combination of ideas in the New Testament in anticipating and seeing the fulfillment of the coming of Jesus as the one who is rebuilding the fallen tent of David. He is the fulfillment of 2 Samuel 7. He is indeed the Messiah of Psalm 2. So the writers of this particular florilegium were at least heading in the right direction, so to speak. They're reading the right passages. They are intuiting that these passages do indeed anticipate some sort of eschatological deliverer. Lastly, let's move to 1 Enoch. And 1 Enoch is fascinating for a lot of different reasons. We'll see 1 Enoch show up in some other videos in Daily Dose. And one of the reasons why it's so interesting is that you do have some Qumran versions that are Aramaic, so that's a fragment of that. You have some Greek versions that are familiar or that we found as well, but the fullest form is in Ethiopic, which you see here on the left. Now, 1 Enoch is actually 5 different books thrown together, if you will, and one of the major sections called the Parables of Enoch, it has a bunch of messianic and Son of Man type stuff as well. So we're going to look at one of those, 1 Enoch 48 through 51, of course not looking at all of it. And it only exists in Ethiopic, and so let's take a look at that. You can see what Ethiopic looks like on the left. But let me just read a few excerpts here. At that hour, the Son of Mankind, and so this is directly indebted to Daniel 7, who called in the presence of the Lord of Spirits, and his name is from before the head of days, which in the Aramaic of Daniel is actually the Ancient of Days. So we have the exact configuration of that scene in Daniel 7, 9 through 14. And what's interesting here is that the name of this Son of Man is in some sense pre-existent. He's before the head of days. And so there's this whole theme in 1 Enoch that this Son of Man figure is in some sense pre-existent. There are three different ways that Son of Man is phrased in the Ethiopic Enoch. It's Weled Savah here, but there's a few other different options. And then we keep going in verse 3. Even prior to when the sun and the signs were formed, prior to when the stars of heaven were made, his name was called before the Lord of Spirits. So again, very clear sense of at least an ideal kind of pre-existence. It's unclear whether he actually had personal bodily existence or if it's just his name that is known. Moving on, and all who dwell on earth will fall down and worship before him. So there's a sense that this Son of Mankind will be worshipped, and they will glorify and bless and sing songs to the Lord of Spirits, and therefore he became the elect one. So there's another title that is applied to the Son of Man figure. He was hidden before him prior to when the world was formed. So prior to Genesis 1, you have this Son of Man figure also being the chosen one or the elect one in Ethiopic here. A few more things we find out about him. And on the day of their oppression, there will be rest on the earth, and before them they will fall and not rise again. There will not be anyone to take up by the hand and raise them up, for they have renounced the Lord of Spirits and his anointed one. So this is mankind's rejection of God and the anointed one. So now we have this Son of Man being associated with a Messiah kind of title. And then we skip down finally, and the elect one in those days will sit upon my throne. So this elect one, who's also the Son of Man, who's also the Messiah, will sit upon a heavenly throne, and so on. And so First Enoch is quite interesting because it clearly predicts a Son of Man figure who's messianic, who's anointed, who's reigning in heaven, who's perhaps in some sense pre-existent, all these different ideas. Things that the New Testament ultimately affirms about Jesus. And so one of the big questions is First Enoch prior to the writing of the New Testament? Is it prior to, or is it after? And that's one of the sort of remaining questions about First Enoch. Certainly other parts of First Enoch, such as the whole first book, are pre-Christian. They're cited, for instance, in Jude 14 through 15. You also have relics of it from Qumran and so forth. But this big middle section, that is one of the big questions about it. If it is pre-Christian, it shows you that, again, a group of intertestamental Jews between the writing of the Old and the New Testament in the Second Temple period were reflecting on some of the same passages, like Daniel, or 2 Samuel, as we've seen, and so forth, and thinking through what does this look like? How's this going to play out for some sort of eschatological deliverer? And why wouldn't they? One of the things I find fascinating about early Messianism and Christology is that both the early Christian community and the Jewish community of its day were drawing from the same well of writings, namely the Hebrew Bible or the Greek Bible translated from it. And so it makes sense that they would have similar ideas. Of course, the early Christian movement was birthed out of a Jewish community. And so they're drawing on the same passages. It's just the big aha moment in the New Testament is that Jesus fulfills all of these things. He's also the Son of Man, he's the Son of David, he's the anointed one, and all those different things. They coalesce in one person as opposed to a plurality of figures. And so hopefully you enjoyed this. If you want to find out more, you can, again, take a look at Corpus Christologicum. Or if you want to spend a bit more time specifically on the New Testament side of the coin, you can pick up my more layperson-oriented Is Jesus Truly God?, which examines in more detail how the Old Testament in particular points forward to the deity of Jesus. That came out with Crossway a couple years ago. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. Once again, Merry Christmas. We'll see you again in future Daily Doses.